The first light of dawn spills over the Nile, painting the river in streaks of gold and crimson. The air hums with the distant sound of fishermen casting their nets, the rustle of papyrus reeds bending in the breeze, and the faint call of priests beginning their morning hymns. This is the world of ancient Egypt, a civilization carved from the very land it worshipped, a place where the line between the divine and the everyday blurred into something extraordinary. And at the heart of it all, moving silently through temples, palaces, and marketplaces, were the scribes. These were the keepers of words, the architects of history, the unseen hands that shaped an empire with nothing more than ink and reed. But what was a day in the life of an Egyptian scribe truly like? Imagine waking before the sun, your fingers already itching to grasp a brush, your mind sharpened by years of memorizing hieroglyphs and formulas. Your work wasn't just writing, it was power. Every tax record you penned, every decree you transcribed, every sacred text you copied held the weight of a civilization that believed words could bend the will of gods. Scribes were the backbone of Egypt, the invisible force that kept the grain counted, the laws enforced, and the stories of pharaohs alive for eternity. And yet, their daily lives, the blisters on their hands, the ink stains on their robes, the quiet pride of mastering a skill few could remain one of history's most fascinating untold stories. Today, we're stepping into their sandals. We'll trace the path of an Egyptian scribe from the moment the temple bells rang at dawn to the final stroke of ink at dusk. You'll discover the grueling training that turned boys into scholars, the secret rituals scribes performed to honor Thoth, the god of wisdom, and the startling truth about how much or how little their lives differed from ours. Along the way, you'll see how their world, though separated by millennia, echoes with the same struggles and triumphs we know today, the pursuit of knowledge, the hunger for respect, and the quiet joy of leaving your mark on history. So take a deep breath. The Nile's breeze carries the scent of lotus flowers and drying ink. The scribe's day is about to begin, and you're here to witness every moment. In ancient Egypt, being a scribe wasn't just a job, it was a golden ticket to privilege. While farmers toiled under the scorching sun and laborers hauled stones for pyramids, scribes sat in the shade, their hands stained not with dirt, but with ink. They were the accountants, the lawyers, the scholars, and the priests of the written word, wielding a power far beyond their humble tools of reed and papyrus. A single scribe could record the harvest yields of an entire province, draft the decrees of a pharaoh, or compose the spells that guided souls through the afterlife. Their work was so vital that they were exempt from the back-breaking manual labor demanded of most Egyptians. No building monuments, no digging canals, no harvesting grain under the watchful eye of an overseer's whip. But their privileges didn't stop there. Scribes were also spared the heavy burden of taxation that weighed on craftsmen and farmers. While others handed over portions of their crops, livestock, or handmade goods, scribes paid their dues in knowledge. A well-written ledger, or a meticulously copied religious text, was currency just as valuable as grain or gold. This exemption wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. In a society that revered the written word as a gift from Thoth, the god of wisdom, scribes were seen as closer to the divine than the common laborer. They weren't just record keepers, they were the bridge between the earthly and the eternal. Their elite status extended into every corner of society. In temples, scribes transcribed sacred rituals, ensuring the gods received the correct prayers to maintain cosmic order. In the royal court, they drafted treaties and laws, their words shaping the fate of nations. Even in the military, scribes kept rosters of troops and recorded battle plans, their scrolls as crucial as any general strategy. And in the schools, known as houses of life, they trained the next generation, passing down not just literacy, but the very culture of Egypt itself. A single mistake in their teachings, a misplaced hieroglyph, an incorrect formula could disrupt rituals, offend the gods, or even doom a soul in the afterlife. Yet what's fascinating is how human their world feels, even across thousands of years. We found scribble exercises where students grumbled about their strict teachers, doodled in the margins of their work, or lamented the long hours of practice. One particularly relatable text, known as the Satire of the Trades, mocks other professions while praising the scribe's life. Behold, there is no profession without a boss except the scribe. He is the boss. It's a reminder that, elite or not, they were still people proud of their craft, weary of their studies, and keenly aware of their unique place in history. Their legacy wasn't just in grand monuments or royal decrees, but in the quiet, everyday acts of keeping a civilization running. Without them, tax collection would descend into chaos, laws would go unenforced, and the stories of pharaohs and gods would fade into silence. They were the unseen gears in the machinery of empire, and their absence would have brought Egypt to a standstill. That's why, even today, their ink words remain etched into temple walls, pressed onto crumbling papyrus, whispering across millennia of the power they once held. The path to becoming a scribe wasn't for the faint of heart. It was a grueling marathon of discipline, repetition, and relentless precision. For an Egyptian boy chosen for this elite path, education began as young as 5 years old, ripped from the carefree days of childhood, and thrust into the austere halls of the House of Life, the scribble schools attached to temples and palaces. Here, under the watchful eyes of strict instructors, students faced a daily regimen that would make even the most diligent scholar tremble, their first task. Mastering hundreds of hieroglyphs, each one a tiny work of art with its own curves, lines, and symbolic meaning. Imagine a child's hand, still unsteady, painstakingly copying the same symbol over and over onto flakes of limestone or broken pottery materials cheap enough for mistake. And mistakes were not tolerated. A single smudged character or misplaced stroke could earn a beating with a reed cane, a harsh reminder that in the world of scribes, perfection was the only standard. But hieroglyphs were just the beginning. Mathematics was equally critical, woven into every aspect of a scribe's work. Students memorized fractions, calculated grain taxes, and solved geometry problems to measure fields after the Nile's annual flood. Their textbooks, problems like, if a loaf of bread is divided among 10 men, how much does each receive? Scribbled in hieratic script, the cursive shorthand of everyday administration. And then came the real test, writing on papyrus, the precious paper of the ancient world. Unlike scratchy pottery shards, papyrus was expensive, reserved only for those who'd proven their skill. Dipping a reed brush into black ink made from soot or red ink from ochre, a young scribe had to write swiftly and flawlessly, no hesitation, no blots. One misstep could ruin an entire sheet, a waste punishable by more than just a cane. The days stretched long and exhausting. From sunrise to sunset, students hunched over their work, backs aching, fingers cramping, the air thick with the scent of ink and sweat. Breaks were rare, and distractions were met with swift punishment. Yet woven into this brutality were moments of strange camaraderie. Archaeologists have found practice sheets where bored students doodled animals in the margins or scribbled complaints like, "The scribe's hand is like the donkey's hoof, it never stops moving." Even then, the frustration of education felt universal. But those who endured emerged as something extraordinary, not just writers, but thinkers, problem solvers, and keepers of Egypt's very soul. Their training wasn't just about letters and numbers. It was about becoming the invisible pillars holding up an empire. The scribe's toolkit was a marvel of simplicity and ingenuity, each tool crafted to transform thoughts into enduring marks on the world. At the heart of their work lay the humble reed brush, cut from the banks of the Nile and sharpened to a fine point. Unlike the rigid pens of later ages, these brushes were flexible, allowing scribes to glide between the thick and thin strokes of hieroglyphs with the grace of a painter. A scribe might carry several, each worn down from hours of use, their tips frayed but still precise testaments to countless records penned, letters composed, and sacred texts copied. Next came the ink palette, a scribe's portable workstation. These rectangular boards, often made of wood or stone, held two small wells for ink, one black, one red. The black ink, the workhorse of their craft, was a mixture of soot from burnt wood or oil, ground finely and blended with water and a touch of gum to help it adhere to papyrus. Red ink, reserved for emphasis or corrections, came from iron-rich ochre, its earthy hue symbolizing vitality and danger. A scribe would kneel before their palette, dipping the reed brush with practiced rhythm, the ink clinging to the fibers like secrets waiting to be spilled. Then, there was the papyrus itself, the ancient world's paper. Harvested from the pith of the Nile's reeds, sliced into strips, pressed, and dried, each sheet was a minor miracle, smooth yet durable, capable of lasting millennia in Egypt's dry air. Scribes wrote on scrolls, unrolling them section by section as they worked, their hands moving in a steady dance across the pale surface. But papyrus was expensive, a luxury for official documents or temple text. For everyday notes, practice, or drafts, scribes turned to ostraka, broken pottery, or limestone flakes scratched with hieratic script, the quicker, cursive cousin of hieroglyphs. These fragments became the scrap paper of antiquity, littered with shopping lists, student exercises, and even the occasional love poem. The making of ink itself was a quiet alchemy. Scribes or their apprentices would grind soot or ochre with a mortar and pestle, the powders fine as temple incense. Water was added drop by drop, the mixture stirred until it flowed like liquid shadow. A pinch of gum arabic, harvested from acacia trees, gave the ink its staying power, ensuring it wouldn't fade or flake away. The result was a concoction both delicate and durable, capable of surviving wars, floods, and the slow creep of centuries. What's striking is how intimate these tools were. A scribe's palette might be plain or beautifully carved, their brushes worn smooth by familiar fingers. Ink stains darken their hands like tattoos, badges of a life spent in service to the written word. And when they made a mistake, no erasers, no delete keys, hit just a lick of the brush to dissolve the error, or a swift stroke of red ink to mark it for correction. Every action was deliberate, every mark permanent. To hold these tools was to hold the power of memory itself, to bend time with nothing more than reed, ink, and the steady rhythm of a scribe's hand. A scribe's workspace was far from the grand halls of pharaohs or the echoing chambers of temples. It was often a quiet corner, bathed in the soft glow of morning light filtering through linen curtains or the dappled shade of a courtyard pump. In temples, they might kneel on rush mats before low wooden tables, their ink palettes balanced on the edge as priests murmured prayers nearby. In the palace, scribes worked in shaded porticos, the cool stone floors offering relief from the midday heat, while officials bustled past with scrolls tucked under their arm. But some of the most fascinating work happened outdoors, under the open sky. Picture a scribe seated by the Nile's edge, a papyrus spread across their lap, the river's breeze ruffling the edges as they recorded the day's cargo shipments, baskets of grain, jars of wine, blocks of limestone destined for a pharaoh's tomb. Light was everything. Without the steady illumination of modern lamps, scribes relied on the sun's path, positioning themselves to catch the clearest rays without squinting. Morning and late afternoon were ideal. Harsh noon light could bleach ink or cast confusing shadows. Indoors, they might work near high windows or beneath oil lamps with carefully trimmed wicks to avoid smoky smudges. The best workspaces were silent but never isolated. Scribes needed to hear the rustle of incoming documents, the murmured questions of officials, even the distant chants of temple rituals that might dictate their next task. Their tools were sparse but meticulously arranged. A wooden palette rested within easy reach, its black and red inks replenished throughout the day. Brushes lay in a neat row, their frayed tips showing signs of constant use. A small clay pot held water for thinning ink or quick corrections, while a pile of ostraka, pottery shards for drafts, sat stacked to one side. Finished scrolls were rolled and stored in labeled jars or leather cases, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of Egypt's administration. The simplicity of their setup belied its efficiency. Every item had a purpose. Every movement was honed by years of repetition. A scribe could pack their tools in moments if summoned to a building site or military camp. Their workspace, as mobile as their skills, were indispensable. What they left behind wasn't just writing, it was the pulse of an empire, etched in ink and waiting to speak across the ages. Before the sun fully rose over the Nile's horizon, a scribe's day began in quiet devotion. Kneeling in the dim light of a household shrine or the temple's outer chamber, they would murmur prayers to Thoth, the ibis-headed god whose dominion over words made him their patron and protector. "Give me a steady hand," they might whisper, "and a mind sharp as the reed's edge." Offerings of honey or incense would smolder on the altar, the sweet smoke curling like ink dissolving in water a sacred exchange for divine favor in the day's work. This wasn't mere ritual, it was a plea for perfection. One miswritten hieroglyph in a religious text could anger the gods, and a single error in a tax ledger might upend a farmer's life. With prayers complete, the scribe turned to practical preparations. A wooden pallet, smoothed by years of use, was laid out beside a clay cup of water. The ink cakes, jet black and rust red, needed careful grinding. Using a small stone, they would crush the pigments into fine dust, each stroke of the pestle a meditation. A few drops of water, a dab of gum arabic, and the mixture transformed into a silky liquid, dark as the fertile Nile mud. The scribe tested the ink's flow on a scrap of pottery, adjusting the consistency until it clung to the reed brush just so. Meanwhile, the day's scrolls were unrolled and weighted with smooth stones at the corners, their blank surfaces waiting like fields ready for planting. Organization was as vital as ink. A scribe serving in the temple might sort ritual texts by the week ceremonies, while a royal administrator arranged census lists or correspondence from distant provinces. Each scroll had its place, its urgency. Some documents, like grain reports, demanded immediate attention. Harvests couldn't wait. Others, like copies of hymns for the Pharaoh's Jubilee, allowed for slower, more deliberate stroke. And always, there were the student exercises, fresh ostraka piled beside the master scribe, ready for the day's lesson in hieratic script or arithmetic. What's striking is how familiar this routine feels. The sharpening of brushes echoes our clicking of pens. The sorting of scrolls mirrors our morning inbox check. Even their superstitions resonate. How many writers today still knock wood or avoid jinxes before starting a project? The scribe's world, though steeped in divine reverence, hummed with the same mundane rhythms that shape any creative life. The gods might guide their hands, but it was the grind of the ink, the weight of the scroll, and the anticipation of the first mark that truly began their day. Among the scribe's most crucial tasks was the meticulous recording of taxes, not just numbers on a scroll, but the lifeblood of Egypt's economy. Every year after the Nile's flood receded, leaving fields thick with fresh silt, scribes fanned out across the countryside like human ledgers. Armed with reed brushes and scrolls, they counted every sheaf of wheat, every jar of oil, every head of cattle owed to the state. A single village harvest might fill dozens of papyrus sheets, 20 sacks of emmer wheat from the field of Nesamun, 15 jars of dates from the palms of Packet, 7 fattened geese from the pens of Hori. These weren't arbitrary demands. Taxes fed the pharaoh's court, supplied the army, and stocked granaries against future famine. The precision was staggering. Scribes measured grain in precise fractions, using hieratic symbols to denote half a sack or a quarter of a jar. They noted the quality of each offering, whether barley was clean or mixed with chaff, if linen was fine or coarse. Livestock counts included not just numbers, but details like age, markings, even the health of a cow's teeth. This granular data let officials spot discrepancies. A farmer claiming his field yielded half the average, or a merchant underreporting imported cedar logs. One surviving tax record from Deir el-Medina shows scribes cross-checking deliveries against prior years, scribbling notes like missing 2 sacks, paid in full, in bold red ink. But taxes weren't just about extraction, they were a form of communication. A scribe's records told the pharaoh which provinces thrived and which struggled, guiding decisions on where to send relief or impose quotas. When drought withered crops in the south, scrolls from the north's bountiful harvests dictated how much grain could be redirected. The system's fairness or lack thereof hinged entirely on the scribe's impartial hand. Farmers couldn't argue an unfair assessment unless a scribe documented their protests, and few dared risk angering the very men who held the power of the written word. The process mirrored modern bureaucracies in uncanny ways. Scribes issued receipts on pottery shards, the ancient equivalent of carbon copies. They filed duplicates in regional archives, creating backup records in case floods or mice destroyed the originals. At the capital, high-ranking scribes audited scrolls, their corrections marked in that telltale red ink. Some even specialized grain scribes, cattle scribes, foreign tribute scribes, each a cog in a machine that fed, clothed, and funded an empire. Yet their work wasn't cold calculation. Between dry tallies, personal notes slipped through, a scribe praising a farmer's honesty, another lamenting a widow's meager offering. One tax scroll from Thebes includes a hastily scribbled prayer beside a poor harvest entry. May Ammon grant better next year. These fleeting humanity reminds us that behind every number was a real life, a truth the scribes, straddling the line between enforcer and witness, understood better than anyone. Beyond taxes and temple scrolls, scribes wielded their reed brushes to shape the most personal moments of Egyptian lives, binding marriages, securing inheritances, and settling bitter disputes with the stroke of ink. A marriage contract from Thebes, etched in hieratic script on papyrus now browned with age, reveals how love and law intertwined. If Tijanina divorces her husband Nebnefer without cause, she must return the 3 deben of silver he gave her father. These weren't romantic vows, but cold, calculated protections, ensuring that if a union dissolved, property changed hands fairly. Scribes didn't just record these agreements, they crafted them, balancing familial expectations with legal precedent, their words turning whispered promises into binding obligations. Land deeds carried even higher stakes. In a civilization where fertile Nile soil meant survival, disputes over field boundaries could ignite generational feuds. Scribes measured plots with knotted ropes, noting landmarks like the tamarisk tree by the canal or the 3rd stone from the irrigation ditch. One deed from Saqqara specifies a vineyard's dimensions down to cubits, then warns, should any dispute this, let him be taken before the court of the vizier. The scribe's precision was armor against chaos. A single omitted detail could leave a family destitute when floods shifted the river's course. But it was in wills that scribes revealed their deepest understanding of human nature. A wealthy merchant's testament might divide assets among sons, daughters, and even loyal servants, but always with conditions. To my son Anquinefer, the house in Memphis, provided he cares for his mother until her burial, reads one will from Abydos. Another stipulates that a daughter inherits only if she remains unmarried for 3 years, shielding wealth from rival clans. Scribes anticipated greed, grief, and betrayal, their clauses as intricate as temple carvings. When disputes erupted, as they often did, these documents became sacred texts in their own right. Court records show scribes not just as notaries, but as mediators. A fragment from Deir el-Medina details a widow's claim against her brother-in-law. He took my husband's goats, saying they were his own. The scribe's notes reveal how he cross-checked older contracts, confirming the animals were indeed part of her dowry. Without his intervention, her survival might have been forfeit. In a world without lawyers, scribes were the closest thing to justice, their archives a firewall against falsehoods. What's remarkable is how modern these conflicts feel. A landowner arguing over misplaced boundary stone echoes today's property lawsuits. A bride's dowry dispute mirrors prenuptial agreements. Even the dry legalese carries whispers of emotional truths. The father anxious to protect his daughter, the merchant desperate to keep his life's work intact. Through it all, the scribe's hand moved steadily, translating human fragility into marks that outlasted kingdoms. Their contracts weren't just records, they were the fragile threads holding society's tapestry together, one carefully inked promise at a time. Inside the temple's inner sanctum, where the air hung heavy with the scent of myrrh and crushed lotus petals, scribes performed their most sacred duty, preserving the words meant to reach the gods themselves. Every hymn, every incantation, every ritual instruction had to be copied with flawless precision. A single misplaced hieroglyph could render a prayer meaningless or worse, offend the deities it was meant to honor. These weren't just texts, they were bridges between the earthly and the divine, and the scribes who transcribed them became conduits for the God's will. Take the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells guiding souls through the afterlife. Scribes spent months painstakingly reproducing its chapters on fresh papyrus, their hands moving with reverent care. Each spell required exact wording, specific illustrations, the weighing of the heart against Maat's feather, Anubis adjusting his scales, and even the ink's consistency had to match temple standards. A funerary text recovered from a Theban tomb shows corrections in red ink where a novice scribe had skipped a line, the error caught just in time before the scroll was sealed with the dead. But their role went beyond copying. Temple scribes also recorded daily offerings, barley, beer, linen, itemized with the same precision as tax record. A single ledger from Karnak lists 36 loaves of bread, 14 jars of honey, and 2 bolts of finest linen, presented to Amun-Ra at dawn, followed by updates as priests replenished the altars throughout the day. These weren't mundane inventories. They were proof of the gods' continued favor, a celestial receipt ensuring divine blessings would flow back to Egypt. At festivals, scribes composed hymns on the spot, adapting verses to honor whichever deity was being celebrated. A surviving hymn to Hathor, scribbled on an ostracon, praises the goddess as the golden one who dances with sistrums, her joy mirrored in the lively, looping hieratic script. The ink itself was sometimes infused with traces of ground malachite or lapis lazuli, so the very pigments shimmered like the gods' celestial forms. What's often overlooked is the hidden pressure in their work. A scribe transcribing a ritual to resurrect Osiris couldn't afford distraction. The pharaoh's entire reign might hinge on the ceremony's success. One miswritten syllable in a healing chant could doom a sick child. That weight of responsibility seeped into their training. Temple scribes underwent years of additional purification rites, fasting before handling certain texts or abstaining from contact with the dead. Their brushes weren't just tools, they were instruments of cosmic order, and their hands had to be as clean as their intentions. Yet even here, humanity peeked through. Between solemn hymns, we find scribbles, a doodle of a cat chasing a bird, a complaint about the priest snoring during night watch. These tiny rebellions remind us that beneath the linen robes and ritual purity, scribes were still men who craved amusement, groaned at long shifts, and occasionally let their minds wander from the divine to the delightfully ordinary. Their legacy lingers in the fragments left behind, a hymn's refrain echoing down millennia, a prayer still legible on crumbling papyrus. These texts were never meant for mortal eyes. They were whispers to the gods, entrusted to scribes who understood that some words, once written, held power beyond the page. When Egyptian armies marched across the desert, swords gleaming and chariots churning dust, scribes moved among them not as warriors, but as the unarmed recorders of history. Their battlefield tools weren't spears or shields, but palettes and scrolls. Their mission to etch the chaos of war into orderly columns of hieratic script. Picture a scribe perched on a rocky outcrop during the siege of Megiddo, tallying captured enemies as arrows whizzed past, or another crouched in a campaign tent by lamplight, drafting a report for Pharaoh Thutmose III that would immortalize his victory. The enemy fled like goats into the mountains, their leaders dragged back in chains, their wealth piled at my majesty's feet. These weren't passive observers. Scribes calculated rations for thousands of troops, ensuring bread and beer supplies kept pace with each day's march. They logged the names and origins of prisoners Libyans with distinctive sidelocks, Nubians tattooed with clan marks, transforming human lives into census data that determined slave assignments or tribute demands. One surviving record from Ramses II's reign lists exactly 3,257 Hittite captives, their fates sealed by the scribes' swift tally marks. But their most potent weapon was propaganda. After battles, scribes composed victory stelae to be carved on temple walls, their words equal parts report and rallying cry. A pharaoh might have led 10,000 men, but it was the scribe who decided whether the enemy died cowardly in their tents or fell like ripe grain before our sickle. At Kadesh, Ramses' scribes famously inflated his near defeat into a solo triumph against impossible odds, their scrolls depicting him as a god-king mowing down entire armies single-handedly. These accounts, circulated across Egypt, didn't just record history, they shaped it, turning raw events into legends that cemented royal power. The risks were real. A scribe near the front lines might dodge stray arrows or succumb to dysentery sweeping the camp, yet their work granted a peculiar kind of immortality. While soldiers' names faded, scribes who documented great campaigns saw their own hands preserved in stone reliefs, a rare honor. In the Temple of Amun at Karnak, one such relief shows a scribe standing calmly amid battle chaos, his brush poised over a scroll as if the screams and clashing bronze around him were mere background noise. What's startling is how little has changed. Modern embedded journalists tallying casualty counts or drafting press releases mirror their ancient counterparts. The scribe's dilemma, truth versus glorification, still echoes wherever wars are written. Their scrolls remind us that history belongs not just to those who fight, but to those who decide how the fighting will be remembered. In the bustling markets and quiet homes of ancient Egypt, where not everyone could read the intricate dance of hieroglyphs or the swift strokes of hieratic script, scribes became the voices of those who had none. A farmer needing to petition the local governor, a soldier stationed at a distant fort, a mother sending word to her son studying in Memphis, all relied on the scribe's steady hand to turn spoken pleas into inked authority. Royal decrees, etched on pristine papyrus with the pharaoh's seal pressed into clay, might command the movement of armies or the construction of monuments. But just as often, scribes penned the quiet, everyday words that stitched lives together. Marriage proposals folded into tiny scrolls, complaints about noisy neighbors scratched onto pottery shards, even love letters perfumed with traces of myrrh to carry the sender's scent. The process was intimate. A woman dictating a letter to her faraway husband would speak slowly, watching as the scribe transformed her halting sentences into graceful script. "Tell him the child walks now," she might say, her voice catching, "and the harvest was good, but the house feels empty." The scribe would listen without interruption, their brush pausing only to dip into ink, capturing not just words but the weight behind them. Personal letters often included affectionate nicknames or inside jokes. One from a wife to her absent spouse teases, "When you return, remember it's my turn to win at Senate," revealing a playful dynamic frozen in time. For official correspondence, scribes adopted a more formal tone. A mayor's complaint about delayed stone shipments to a vizier would open with elaborate greetings. "To the honored steward, may Ra grant you health and wisdom," before diving into the sharp reminder that the temple's foundation remains unfinished due to your negligence. These documents were performative, layered with politeness that could thinly veil frustration or desperation. The scribe's skill lay in balancing respect with urgency, knowing the wrong phrasing could delay justice or worse, provoke anger. Illiteracy didn't mean ignorance. Those receiving letters often recognized their personal seals or the distinctive handwriting of trusted scribes, guarding against forgeries. Some senders included small tokens, a lock of hair, a bead from a broken necklace, to prove authenticity. When a scribe read a letter aloud to its recipient, they became an actor of sorts, modulating their voice for a king's thunderous decree or softening it for a homesick soldier's message. One military scribe's note from a frontier outpost captures this duality. "Your mother's words are gentle as Nile reeds," he reads, before switching tones to relay the pharaoh's order, "Hold the fortress at all cost." The fragility of these connections was heartbreaking. A letter found in the ruins of a workers' village at Deir el-Medina contains a desperate plea, "Why you not write to me? Have I offended you?" The scribe's even strokes can't mask the sender's raw loneliness. Other letters were never delivered, folded and tucked away, lost in the shuffle of daily life, only to surface millennia later as testaments to the universal need to be heard. What's striking is how little separates their world from ours. The scribe's reed brush was the ancient ancestor of our smartphones, their papyrus the texting app of the age. The same emotions pulse through their inked pleas and our typed messages. Love, frustration, longing, pride. In a civilization without paper or postal systems, scribes were the lifelines, turning whispers into permanence, ensuring that no matter how wide the Nile stretched between people, words could always bridge the gap. When the Nile's annual floodwaters finally receded, leaving behind a fresh layer of rich black silt, scribes faced one of their most daunting mathematical challenges: redistributing farmland. The river's capricious nature meant field boundaries vanished overnight, erased as thoroughly as if they never existed. Armed with coiled measuring ropes, knotted at precise intervals, and wooden tablets smeared with temporary ink, teams of scribes waded through ankle-deep mud to recalculate every plot. Their work demanded more than arithmetic, it required diplomacy. A farmer who lost land to the river's shift might brandish a decades-old deed, while his neighbor insisted the fertile new bend belonged to him. The scribes' calculations had to be indisputable, their hieratic numerals crisp enough to silence arguments. One surviving survey from the Middle Kingdom shows how they did it. Fields sketched as rectangles with exact dimensions noted, 200 cubits north to south, 150 cubits east to west, alongside the owner's name and tax obligation. A single cubit's discrepancy could spark violence, so scribes worked in pairs, calling measurements aloud like priests chanting hymns, each number cross checked against the other's tally. But their mathematical prowess truly shone in pyramid construction. The Great Pyramid alone required 2,300,000 limestone blocks, each averaging 2.5 tons, a logistics nightmare scribes turned into orderly tables. Labor calculations survive on flakes of limestone, so many men to quarry a block, so many to drag it along lubricated sledges, so many to hoist it into place. One fragment from Gezer records a shift rotation, 1,200 men working 10-day stints, with beer and bread rations meticulously adjusted for their effort. Scribes didn't just count blocks, they calculated angles, ensuring each layer's precise inward tilt to form the pyramid's flawless geometry. Using nothing but palm fiber ropes and polished copper tools, they achieved accuracy modern engineers still marvel at. The Great Pyramid sides deviate less than 4 centimeters, 230 meters. Their genius lay in practical solutions. When a quarry yielded fewer stones than expected, scribes adjusted the workforce on the fly, borrowing men from other crews and recalculating rations without missing a beat. They tracked materials like accountants auditing a fortune, 440 cartloads of gypsum mortar, 5,000 copper chisels replaced monthly, 50,000 liters of beer to keep 30,000 workers hydrated. The Rhine mathematical papyrus, essentially a scribe's manual, reveals their methods, problems teaching how to divide 9 loaves equally among 10 men or calculate the slope of a ramp. These weren't abstract exercises, they were survival skills for running a civilization where a miscalculation could delay a pharaoh's tomb or starve a work crew. Perhaps most impressive was their grasp of fractions long before Europe adopted them. Egyptian fractions were unit-based instead of 3/4. They wrote 1/2 plus 1/4, a system that seems cumbersome until you witness its elegance in practice. A scribe dividing 7 sacks of grain among 10 workers wouldn't struggle with decimal points. They neatly allocate 2/3 of a sack to each, then handle the remainder with smaller fractions, all recorded in clean hieratic strokes. Surviving payroll records show this system in action, with laborers paid in grain portions so precise that disputes over missing handfuls could be resolved mathematically. Their legacy isn't just in pyramids or perfectly divided fields, but in the very notion that numbers could tame chaos. When modern surveyors use GPS to map shifting coastlines or engineers simulate stresses on steel beams, they walk a path first laid by scribes kneeling in the mud, rope in one hand and brush in the other, turning the unruly world into columns of figures that even time couldn't erase. In the dim light of a temple workshop, where the scent of crushed herbs clung to the air like a prayer, scribes bent over medical papyri that held the fragile line between life and death. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving surgical texts, reveals their meticulous craft not just copying, but preserving knowledge of how to stitch a wound with linen thread, set a broken jaw with honey-coated splints, or diagnose a head injury by observing the patient's ability to answer questions. Each entry followed a strict formula: examination, diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. If you encounter a man with a gaping wound in his skull, one passage instructs, and he shudders at the touch of your fingers, say, "This is an ailment I will fight." The scribe's hand had to be as steady as the surgeon's, their hieratic script precise enough that no healer would misread a dosage of bark for pain or mistake the angle of a bone setting. Yet medicine wasn't just science, it was spellcraft. The Ebers Papyrus, a sprawling compendium of remedies, wove together practical treatments and enchantments. A scribe might transcribe a cure for baldness, a mix of crushed lettuce and donkey hoof, on the same page as an incantation to banish intestinal worms. Begone, son of pestilence. May Isis smite you with her golden broom. These weren't contradictions to the Egyptians. A physician treating a fever might administer a tincture of poppy while whispering spells to Sekhmet, the lioness goddess of healing, believing both were needed to drive out illness. Scribes guarded these dual approaches fiercely, adding warnings like "do not let the uninitiated see this," beside potent recipes involving mandrake or lead-based cosmetics. The stakes of their work were visceral. One papyrus details a method for diagnosing pregnancy by having a woman urinate on barley and emmer wheat. If the barley sprouted, it was a boy. If the emmer grew, a girl. Another lists symptoms of a heart attack with startling accuracy: pain in the arm, chest like a weight, breath like a trapped bird, but errors could be deadly. A scribe miscopying a dosage of hemlock in a pain remedy or omitting a crucial step in a childbirth protocol might doom patients. Temple scribes underwent purification rituals before handling such texts, washing their hands in natron solution as if preparing for surgery themselves. What's haunting is how personal these papyri could become. Between standardized treatments, scribes sometimes added marginal notes, a healer's observation that a certain wound poultice worked better with added garlic, or a reminder to check a patient's moon sign before administering dream-inducing herb. The Kahun gynecological papyrus even includes spaces where a physician could record a woman's name and symptoms, turning the document into an ancient medical chart. These small touches reveal the scribes not as passive copyists, but as active participants in a living tradition of care. Their legacy endures in unexpected ways. Modern doctors still use the Egyptian term "oran," meaning that which flows, to describe migraines, and the pulse checking techniques described in papyri foreshadow today's circulatory studies. But perhaps their greatest lesson lies in their holistic view, that healing required both the measurable and the mystical, the scalpel and the whispered plea to the gods. In an age before antibiotics or X-rays, the scribe's ink was the thread stitching together body and soul, one careful hieroglyph at a time. Hieroglyphs weren't merely symbols, they were miniature masterpieces, each stroke infused with both meaning and aesthetic grace. When scribes etched these sacred signs onto tomb walls or monument facades, they didn't just write, they performed a visual dance, transforming functional script into art. Take the burial chamber of Queen Nefertari, where hieroglyphs curve like tendrils of ivy around scenes of her journey through the afterlife. The glyph for water ripples with realistic waves, the sun disk glows with gilded edges, and even the humble reed leaf is rendered with such delicacy that you half expect it to rustle in the tomb's silent air. This wasn't decoration for its own sake. Every embellishment served a deeper purpose, ensuring the words pulsed with the same vitality as the spells they carried. The tools of artistic writing reveal how scribes blurred the line between scribe and artist. Fine-tipped reed brushes could switch from hair-thin lines to bold flourishes in a single motion. Pigments came alive with ground minerals, malachite greens for eternal growth, lapis blues echoing the night sky, ochre reds symbolizing life's fiery essence. In the tomb of Ramses VI, scribes mixed powdered gold into ink for divine names, making them shimmer in torchlight as if touched by Ra himself. Card etches encircling royal names weren't just ovals, they became intricate braids of rope, their ends deftly knotted to repel evil. Even the negative space between glyphs was carefully considered, arranged to form hidden patterns, a lotus blossom emerging from stacked syllables, a serpent's coiled body implied by the curve of adjacent sign. Yet this artistry demanded precision. A single misplaced flourish could alter meaning, an overextended stroke might turn the peaceful Ankh life into the dangerous Ket fire. Scribes trained for years to balance creativity with exactitude, learning when to elongate the legs of the Jur pillar glyph for elegance without confusing it with the similar was scepter. Some tombs show evidence of careful planning, faint red grid lines still visible beneath finished carvings, proving scribes mapped each sign's proportions like architects drafting a temple. The most breathtaking examples live in the Book of the Dead Scrolls, where hieroglyphs intertwine with illustrations. In the Papyrus of Ani, the weighing of the heart spell curls around the scene itself, its glyphs forming a bridge between Anubis and the scales. The word truth, Mat, often sprouts tiny feathers, echoing the goddess's emblem, while sinister terms like chaos are written in jagged, uneasy strokes. These weren't random choices, they were visual incantations, where beauty amplified magic. Watching a scribe at work on such a piece must have been mesmerizing. Dipping between ink pots with the fluidity of a painter, they'd pause to rotate the papyrus for better brush angles, or blow gently on a fresh stroke to prevent smudging. Some signed their masterpieces discreetly, a tiny scarab carved into a corner, a single hieroglyph tucked into a border proof that even in service to gods and kings, the scribe's pride in craft couldn't be fully contained. What survives today is more than writing. It's a testament to how the Egyptians saw language itself as something alive, dimensional. In their hands, a funeral prayer could become a flock of birds taking flight. A king's name might unfurl like a banner in the wind, and even tax records on mundane limestone shards occasionally bore a clerk's doodled lotus because for scribes, beauty wasn't optional. It was the very current that carried meaning across the river of time. By midday, when the sun hung directly overhead like a burning copper disk, even the most diligent scribe would set aside their brushes. The air in the workspace grew thick with the scent of baking bread from nearby ovens, a signal that the sacred rhythm of ancient Egypt, work, eat, rest, was about to pause. Scribes didn't just eat to live. Their meals were a ritual, a brief communion with the gods who blessed their food and the land that provided it. A typical lunch might seem humble by modern standards: coarse barley bread, so dense it could last for days without spoiling, and a clay jug of beer so thick it was practically a meal itself. But these weren't mere staples. They were gifts from Osiris, who taught humanity to cultivate grain, and from Hathor, the goddess whose laughter was said to ferment the first beer. Communal dining halls near temples buzzed with activity as scribes gathered, their ink-stained fingers now tearing into warm loaves. Unlike laborers, who often ate in the fields, scribes enjoyed the privilege of shade, sometimes under palm-thatched roofs, other times in the columned courtyards of administrative buildings. Fish from the Nile, salted or freshly grilled, provided protein. Tomb paintings show scribes delicately picking bones from tilapia or perch. Onions, garlic, and lentils rounded out the meal, their pungent aromas mingling with the earthy smell of papyrus scrolls stacked nearby. Beer, brewed from fermented bread, was safer to drink than Nile water and served as both refreshment and sustenance, its frothy warmth a small luxury in a life ruled by discipline. Temple scribes might dine closer to the gods, literally. In Karnak, priestly scribes ate in halls where offerings to Ammon were first presented, leftovers from divine plates, as it were. These meals carried spiritual weight. Consuming bread blessed in the temple was thought to infuse the scribe with wisdom. One graffiti-scratched ostrachan from Dera Medina jokes about a scribe who stole extra temple loaves, writing, "Thoth gives knowledge, but a man must still fill his belly." Yet even here, hierarchy dictated details. Senior scribes reclined on cushions, their food served on polished wooden trays, while apprentices squatted on reed mats with simple pottery bowls. Menus varied by status. A royal scribe might enjoy duck stewed in pomegranate juice, while a village record keeper may do with dried dates and goat cheese. But the true marker of privilege wasn't the food itself, it was time. A farmer swallowed his meal standing. A scribe could linger, discussing the morning's work or debating the correct hieroglyph for harvest over a second cup of beer. The remnants of these meals tell their own stories. Archaeologists have found bread molds still bearing thumbprints, fish bones scored by careful teeth, and beer jars inscribed with the names of scribes who shared them. These weren't just breaks from work. They were moments of camaraderie where ink-stained hands passed bowls instead of scrolls, and the weight of words briefly gave way to the simple joy of a full stomach. In a civilization that believed the afterlife required eternal meals, perhaps no act was more sacred than pausing to eat, proof that even those who wrote history needed to live it, one bite at a time. As the sun began its slow descent, casting elongated shadows across the papyrus-strewn workspace, the scribe's duties shifted from sacred texts and legal scrolls to the rhythmic hum of administration. The afternoon was a symphony of ink and accountability, where the meticulous recording of grain sacks and linen bolts held as much sway as any hymn to the gods. In the storms of temples and palaces, scribes moved with practiced efficiency, their reed brushes dancing across ledger after ledger. One record from the Ramesseum details a single afternoon's work: 34 jars of honey inspected, 16 found with cracked seals, 200 bolts of linen counted, 3 requiring mending. These weren't dry lists, but living snapshots of an empire's pulse, where every stroke of the brush kept chaos at bay. Supervising laborers added another layer to their role. Unlike overseers who wielded whips, scribes commanded with the power of the written word. At a quarry near Aswan, a scribe might stand beneath a makeshift awning, tallying blocks of red granite as sweating workers hauled them onto sledges. His notes determined their pay full rations for those who met quotas, reduced portions for slackers, but fairness mattered. One ostraka from Deir el-Mediner records a scribe intervening when a laborer named Penub protested his reduced bread allotment. Penub's son fell ill, deduct from my own share instead, the scribe wrote, revealing an unexpected compassion beneath the bureaucratic veneer. Census updates were perhaps their most delicate task. Door to door they went, recording births, deaths, and the comings of age that shifted tax obligations. A family grieving a child might face the scribe's indifferent brush, as he noted. House of Amenhotep, one fewer mouth to feed, yet sometimes humanity broke through. A census scroll from Akhmim includes a marginal note beside an elderly woman's name. Blind but still weaves fine cloth, a testament to her value beyond the numbers. The sheer variety of their duties was staggering. 1 hour might find them calculating the angle of a pyramid's casing stones with architects, the next mediating a dispute between fishermen over Nile fishing rights. A scribe in the docks of Memphis could transition from recording imported cedar logs to scribbling a love letter for an illiterate sailor to send home. Their work was the grease that kept civilization's gears turning, unseen, unglamorous, and utterly indispensable. What's remarkable is how these ancient routines mirror modern bureaucracy. The scribes' inventory checks are ancestors to today's warehouse audits. Their census forms foreshadow tax records. Even their frustrations feel familiar. A hastily scribbled complaint on an ostracon reads, "The overseer demands numbers before the count is finished," proving that some workplace struggles truly are timeless. Through it all, the scribes had never stilled, transforming the fleeting details of daily life into marks that would outlast empires. The relationship between master scribe and apprentice was far more than lessons in brushstrokes. It was a sacred passing of the torch, a bond woven from ink and expectation. Imagine a weathered teacher seated cross-legged under the dappled shade of a sycamore, watching as his student's trembling hand attempts the hieroglyph for eternity. The older man's critique isn't gentle. "Your strokes are as shaky as a drunken ox," he might say, quoting a common scribble proverb. A steady hand mirrors a disciplined mind. Training wasn't just technical, it was moral. The instruction of Keti, a text used in scribble schools, warned apprentices against laziness with vivid metaphors. The scribe's reed is a crocodile's tooth hesitate, and it will snap shut on your fingers. Every lesson carried layers. A simple exercise in copying the Sat hieroglyph, a tied bundle symbolizing unity, became a lecture on loyalty to pharaoh and family. Mathematics drills doubled as ethics classes, just as fractions must balance to form a whole. So must a scribe weigh truth against personal gain. Surviving student ostraker reveal this duality. One side bears meticulous tax calculations, the other scribbled lines like, "The dishonest scribe drowns in his own ink," a maxim beaten into young minds through repetition. The best teachers wielded patience as finely as their brushes. A New Kingdom scribble manual advises, correct twice, then let error be its own lesson. But compassion had limits. One particularly stern instructor's note, scrawled on a botched assignment, reads, "If your hand refuses to obey, perhaps the cane will remind it." Yet between these harsh lines, glimpses of tenderness emerge. A faded letter from a master to his ailing apprentice says, "The house of life is dim without your laughter. Return when the fever breaks." Proverbs were their teaching tools, each a capsule of wisdom. The scribe's shadow stretches longest at noon, reminding students that mastery reveals itself in pressure. Papyrus endures where memory fades, emphasizing writing's sacred duty. Some maxims shocked with their pragmatism, better a sharp tongue and dull brush than vice versa, acknowledging that eloquence could salvage poor penmanship in court. The most poignant, to teach is to carve your name on another's heart, suggesting a legacy beyond monuments. The weight of this mentorship echoes in student artifacts. A child's practice board from Amarna shows gentle corrections in red ink, not from a cane-wielding master, but a peer. A worn wooden palette, inherited by an apprentice after his teacher's death, bears both their names, the older one nearly rubbed away from touch. These weren't just instructors, they were the guardians of civilization's memory, knowing that every crooked hieroglyph straightened, every moral principle absorbed, meant Egypt's soul would outlive its stone. The life of a scribe wasn't all ink-stained glory. It came with aches that would make any modern office worker groan in sympathy. Hours of hunching over papyrus in dim light left eyes strained and fingers cramped, their joints stiff as dried reeds. Archaeologists have found scribble palettes with grooves worn deep by restless fingers, and ostraka covered in practice strokes that grow progressively messier, betraying the fatigue of a hand pushed past its limits. One particularly relatable text, scrawled by a disgruntled student, whines, "My fingers are like twisted roots, my back bent like an old bow, why must writing hurt so much?" Even the elite weren't spared. A royal scribe's tomb inscription boasts of his skill but adds, "Though my sight dimmed from years in shadowed halls." Lighting was a constant struggle. Without the steady glow of electric lamps, scribes relied on flickering oil wicks that smoked and sputtered, leaving soot on scrolls and stinging eyes. A satirical piece from Deir el-Medina jokes about a scribe whose work was more tear stains than ink, his vision blurred by hours squinting in bad light. Some relief came from working outdoors at dawn or dusk, but midday sun could bleach ink or parch papyrus, forcing scribes into stuffy, shadowed rooms where the air hung heavy with the scent of sweat and drying ink. Repetitive stress injuries were the scribe's silent nemesis. The hieroglyph for write shows a hand gripping a brush, a pose held for so long that arthritis likely plagued many professionals. Medical papyri describe remedies for the scribe's curse, his swollen joints treated with poultices of honey and willow bark, or stiff shoulders massaged with myrrh-infused oil. One healer's note prescribes stretching exercises. Let the scribe raise his arms like heron's wings at each hour's turning, yet perhaps the most humanizing finds are the doodles and complaints tucked between official records. A temple ledger from Karnak has a margin sketch of a scribe rubbing his eyes, captioned, "Thoth, give me strength." Another ostracon lists the writer's grievances like a manifesto. The light fails, the ink runs thick, my neck aches, and still the overseer demands more scrolls. These weren't just whines, they were tiny acts of rebellion against the relentless demand for perfection. The physical toll reveals an irony. Those who enshrined eternity in ink were bound by fragile, aching bodies. A scribe's work might last millennia, but his hands could barely last the day. Yet they persevered, their discomfort immortalized in the very texts they cursed, proof that even in ancient Egypt, the grind of daily work was as universal as the desire to complain about it. When the last scroll was rolled and the ink palette dried, scribes shed the weight of their duties like a cloak left at the door. Leisure was not just relaxation, it was a celebration of the same creativity that fueled their work. Senet, the ancient game of strategy and fate, became their battlefield of choice, its carved ebony pieces clattering across a board painted with 30 squares of symbolic peril and triumph. Archaeologists have found these boards tucked beneath scribes' benches, some worn smooth from years of play, others hastily scratched onto limestone shards for impromptu matches. The rules, though partially lost to time, clearly mirrored life's uncertainties. Players dodge water squares that send them back to start, or landed on House of Rebirth spaces offering a second chance. A scribe's sharp mind, trained to calculate grain taxes or pyramid slopes, now strategized how to navigate the board's unseen traps, all while betting sips of beer or scraps of precious papyrus on the outcome. But games were only half the escape. In the cool of the evening, when the Nile's breeze carried the scent of blooming lotuses, scribes traded official records for verses that pulsed with humor and heart. Love poetry, written on fragile ostraka or whispered in gardens, reveals a side of them bureaucracy never captured. One particularly tender piece from Deir el-Medina compares a lover's voice to honey wine poured at dawn, its hieratic script flowing as smoothly as the metaphors it spun. These weren't crude dalliances, they were intricate dances of wordplay, where fishing stood for courtship and reeds bending in the current hinted at surrender to passion. Satire, though, was where scribes truly unshackled their wit. This satire of the trades, a masterpiece of comedic exaggeration, lampooned every profession but their own. Soldiers were mocked for marching with blisters like grapes, fishermen for smelling worse than rotten eggs, and weavers for becoming hunchbacked as aged apes. The punchline, behold, the scribe, he pays no taxes, fears no overseer, and his only sweat is from choosing which fine robe to wear. This wasn't just mockery, it was a sly affirmation of their elite status, wrapped in jokes that would feel at home in a modern stand-up routine. Even leisure served a deeper purpose. Senate boards were often inscribed with prayers to Thoth, blurring the line between play and ritual. Love poems, though personal, followed strict metrical patterns that kept scribes' linguistic skills razor-sharp. And satire, while hilarious, honed their ability to critique power, a dangerous skill they could deploy in court or temple when needed. The same hand that drafted laws could deftly move a game piece or trace the curve of a lover's name in the sand, proving that for scribes, creativity wasn't confined to duty. It was the ink that stained their world with color, both on and off the page, as the sun dipped below the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and indigo. The scribe's workspace transformed into a sanctuary of quiet ritual. Scrolls that had lain open all day, their surfaces dense with hieroglyphs and calculations, were now carefully rolled and tied with linen cords. Each twist of the cord was deliberate, securing months of labor tax records, legal contracts, hymns to the gods against the night's encroaching dampness. The finest documents, like temple prayers or royal decrees, were tucked into cylindrical leather cases lined with cedar shavings to repel insects, while less precious drafts found refuge in woven reed baskets. Every motion was infused with reverence. To mishandle a scroll was to risk erasing a fragment of eternity. The ink palette, once the day's most active tool, now demanded meticulous care. A damp linen cloth wiped away the last remnants of black and red pigments, the colors swirling together like the Nile's silt-laden waters before vanishing. Brushes, their frayed tips softened by hours of use, were rinsed in a clay bowl until the water ran clear, then laid bristle up to dry on a sun-warmed stone, a small defiance against the rot that could ruin them overnight. Scribes knew these tools were extensions of their own hands. Neglect invited clumsiness, and clumsiness bred errors that could unravel lives, but the true closing rite belonged to Thoth. Before extinguishing the oil lamp, the scribe would raise their hands in brief homage to the ibis-headed god, whispering gratitude for steady fingers and a mind sharp enough to navigate the day's demands. Some left offerings, a drop of honey smeared on the palette's edge, a stolen moment to sketch Thoth's emblem, a crescent moon balanced atop a scribe's brush on a scrap of pottery. These weren't empty gestures. In a world where words held power, Thoth was both patron and judge, the divine scribe who recorded every human deed in the halls of the afterlife. To thank him was to acknowledge the weight of their craft. With tools stowed and prayers uttered, the scribe might pause to tally the day's work. Not in numbers, but in satisfaction, the merchant's land dispute resolved, the widow's petition for tax relief drafted, the hymnal for tomorrow's festival copied without a single error. Even the smallest accomplishment carried a quiet pride, for every stroke of ink had ripple effects, ensuring a soldier's family received his wages. A farmer's harvest was fairly taxed. A pharaoh's glory echoed in temple carvings. The flickering lamplight would catch the scribe's face as they blew out the flame, shadows pooling in the grooves of ink-stained fingers. Tomorrow would bring fresh scrolls, fresh calculations, fresh prayers. But for now, in the hush of twilight, there was only the scent of papyrus and the certainty that their words, however humble, had nudged the world toward order. And in ancient Egypt, that was a kind of magic all its own. A scribe's evenings weren't always spent hunched over papyrus. Some of their most vital work happened at feasts, where wine flowed as freely as secrets. In the banquet halls of nobles and high priests, scribes moved between roles, part diplomat, part gossipmonger, part power broker. A well-placed word over roasted duck and pomegranate wine could secure promotion, smooth over a bureaucratic feud, or even alter the fate of a temple's construction project. One surviving letter from a scribe named Pentueret to his mentor boasts, "I dined at the vizier's table last night, and by the third cup, he agreed to double our papyrus allowance." These gatherings were more than social events. They were the invisible ledger where favors were tallied as meticulously as grain taxes. The hierarchy at these feasts mirrored the rigid structure of Egyptian society. Junior scribes clustered near the entrance, nibbling on spiced lentils while straining to catch fragments of conversation from the high table. Senior scribes, their linen robes perfumed with frankincense, reclined closer to the host, exchanging knowing glances as musicians plucked harp. A particularly cunning scribe might leverage their literacy to flatter, composing impromptu verses praising the host's generosity, or discreetly recording a drunken noble's ramblings for later leverage. One satirical text, "The Misadventures of a Court Scribe," mocks this dance. He laughs too loud at the treasurer's jokes, though they're as stale as last year's bread. But it wasn't all calculation. Personal letters revealed genuine friendships forged over shared struggles. A group of scribes stationed at a remote desert outpost left behind a trove of notes complaining about the heat, the scorpions, and their mutual longing for Memphis Tavern. One scrawled on a broken jar, "If I must eat another date pudding without your jests, I'll throw myself to the crocodiles." These bonds often transcended rank. When a scribe named Hori fell ill, his superior penned a plea to the gods so poetic it was later copied as a model text. "May Thoth, who knows the weight of every word, lift the fever from his brow as gently as a brushstroke." Networking wasn't confined to feasts. Marketplaces became stages for casual influence. A scribe might pause at a spice merchant's stall to chat, only to overhear a rumor about a scribble position opening in the vizier's office. Temples, too, were hubs of social maneuvering after morning prayers. Scribes lingered near altars to exchange news wrapped in pious language. A prayer to Thoth could segue into whispered updates about which official was in disgrace or which gnome's governor was seeking a new accountant. The stakes of these interactions were high. A misstep, a joke taken poorly, a confidence betrayed could doom a career, yet the rewards were sweeter than Nile honey. A scribe who navigated these waters skillfully might rise to oversee an entire temple's archives, or even catch the pharaoh's ear. The tomb of a scribe named Mena shows him feasting eternally among nobles, his palette and brush replaced by a golden cup, proof that in Egypt the pen wasn't just mightier than the sword. It was the key to immortality. Among the ranks of Egypt's scribes, a few figures rose beyond the confines of ink and papyrus to etch their names into history with the bold strokes of legend. Take Hormheb, the scribe who clawed his way from the archives to the throne itself. Born into obscurity, his early career was spent recording grain stores in the dusty backrooms of Memphis. But Hormheb possessed more than literacy. He had an uncanny grasp of power's geometry. When Pharaoh Tutankhamun's court descended into chaos, it was Hormheb's pen that drafted the edicts restoring order, his words smoothing the path for his own ascent. By the time the crown touched his brow, he'd rewritten his destiny with the same precision he once applied to tax scrolls, proving that in Egypt, a scribe's reed could be mightier than a general's spear. Then there was Amenhotep, son of Hapu, a man whose wisdom transcended his station. Unlike Hormheb's ruthless ambition, Amenhotep's influence flowed from his intellect. As royal scribe to Amenhotep III, he wasn't just a recorder, he was an architect of policy, a mediator in foreign disputes, and a scholar whose treatises on medicine and astronomy were reverenced long after his death. Temples erected in his honor bore inscriptions praising his mind sharper than the obelisk's point, a rare tribute for a commoner. Even the gods seemed to favor him. Centuries later, Egyptians would worship him as a healing saint, leaving offerings at his statues as if he'd been born divine. Women scribes, though fewer in record, left their mark too. A fragment from Deir el-Medina names a scribe named Ertugrul, mistress of the sacred scripts, who oversaw temple archives in Thebes. Her signature, a neat cluster of hieroglyphs beside a rare feminine title, hints at a world where some women breach the scribble elite. Another, Ternutet, appears in a tomb mural holding a palette while male colleagues bow slightly in her direction, a subtle nod to her authority. But perhaps the most intriguing figure is the anonymous scribe behind the satire of the trades. With biting wit, He skewered every profession but his own, lambasting fishermen for reeking of rotten nets and soldiers for blistered feet. His work wasn't just comedy, it was propaganda, elevating scribes into the cultural consciousness as the only ones who walked in the shadow of palaces, unburned by the sun. The irony, he's remembered not by name, but by the very craft he celebrated, his voice echoing through millennia because he knew the pen's true power, to immortalize, to persuade, and above all, to endure. Each of these scribes, whether through cunning, brilliance, or sheer force of personality, transformed their role from silent recorders to shapers of history. Their stories remind us that in a civilization built on words, those who mastered them didn't just document the world, they changed it. The true power of Egyptian scribes wasn't just in recording history, it was in weaving the very fabric of civilization that stretched far beyond the Nile's banks. Without their painstaking transcriptions, Egypt's grand temples would have crumbled into silent ruins, its medical breakthroughs lost to time, and its gods forgotten like whispers in the wind. Consider the Edwin Smith papyrus, a surgical manual so advanced it detailed brain anatomy and suturing techniques millennia before Europe abandoned the notion that illness came from angry spirits. This wasn't just medicine, it was a lighthouse of human progress, and it survived because scribes copied it relentlessly, generation after generation, even as dynasties rose and fell around them. Religious texts reveal an even deeper legacy. The pyramid texts, inscribed on tomb walls to guide pharaohs to the afterlife, evolved over centuries into the coffin texts, and finally the Book of the Dead, each iteration preserved and refined by scribes who understood their sacred duty. A single omission could mean a soul lost in darkness, so they worked with monastic precision, their hieroglyphs functioning as both prayer and passport to eternity. When archaeologists unrolled the papyrus of Ani in the 19th century, they weren't just reading spells, they were hearing echoes of scribes who believed their brushes could literally hold death at bay. But their influence stretched beyond the spiritual. Scribes were the silent engines of Egypt's bureaucracy, creating systems so efficient they enabled feats like the construction of the pyramids. The Rhind mathematical papyrus, essentially a scribe's training manual, contains geometry problems used to calculate ramps and stone blocks with near-modern accuracy. Without these scribble innovations, Khufu's monument would have remained a dream sketched in desert sand. Even trade flourished under their meticulous records. A ledger from the reign of Ramses II details exact exchanges of Nubian gold for Lebanese cedar, proving scribes were the unseen diplomats who knit together an empire. Perhaps their most startling impact was on literature itself. The tale of the shipwrecked sailor, copied and recopied for 1,000 years, became the prototype for adventure stories, its themes of survival and divine mercy echoing in Homer and later epics. The Instructions of Amenemop, with its moral teachings on humility and justice, influenced Hebrew proverbs centuries later, proof that scribes didn't just preserve ideas, they let them breathe across borders and eras. Their fragility makes their endurance all the more astonishing. Papyrus crumbles, ink fades, and yet because scribes valued repetition as sacred, we can still read hymns to Isis composed when the pyramids were young. When the Library of Alexandria burned, taking countless scrolls with it, Egypt's core knowledge survived in temple archives and tomb carvings, safeguarded by generations of scribes who treated each copy as a covenant with the future. What's often overlooked is how their legacy shaped far more than Egypt. Greek historians like Herodotus built on their chronicles, Roman emperors mimicked their administrative systems, and modern linguists cracked the code of hieroglyphs using their very own bilingual documents like the Rosetta Stone. Every time a doctor writes a prescription, a lawyer drafts a contract, or a poet revises a stanza, they walk a path first inked by scribes who understood that words properly kept could outlast stone. The irony is delicious. Those who served in the shadows ended up casting the longest shadows of all. Hollywood would have you believe every Egyptian scribe was a stern-faced man hunched in temple shadows, churning out tax records like some ancient accountant. But peel back the layers of time, and you'll find the truth is far more colorful and far less exclusive. Take Merit Ta, whose name means beloved of Ta. Carved into a tomb in Saqqara, she's hailed as not just a scribe, but the world's first recorded female physician, her prescriptions and diagnoses penned with the same authority as any male counterpart. Or consider the tomb paintings of Nebet, a woman depicted with a scribe's palette dangling from her wrist, her titles including Overseer of Scribes in the court of Pepi II. These weren't anomalies, they were proof that literacy and power weren't gendered traits in a society where goddesses like Seshat ruled the written word itself. The myth of scribes as mere bureaucrats is equally misleading. Sure, they tallied grain and dictated legal disputes, but they also penned love poetry so vivid it can make a modern romance novelist blush. The Chester Beatty Papyrus, a collection of erotic verses, includes lines like, "Her hair is the night sky, and I am the falcon who longs to fly through it," composed by scribes who clearly understood passion as deeply as percentages. Even their administrative work brimmed with creativity. A tax record from Deir el-Medina devolves into a doodle of a cat wearing a judge's wig, presiding over a trial of mice. Another scribe's ledger includes a cheeky note beside a delinquent farmer's name, claims his donkey ate the grain, the donkey, when questioned, remained silent. Then there's the stereotype of the scribe as a solitary, ink-stained recluse. In reality, they were the social butterflies of antiquity. A scribe named Jehudamhat left behind a dinner invitation so elaborate it lists courses like honey-glazed duck and figs stuffed with almonds, followed by the tantalizing postscript, "Bring your own best stories." They were the original networkers, trading favors over beer, mediating feuds with wit as much as writs. One legal text from Thebes shows a scribe resolving a land dispute by suggesting both parties share the harvest, a solution so diplomatic it still impresses today. Perhaps the most persistent myth is that scribes are mere copyists, their brushes devoid of original thought. Tell that to the author of The Eloquent Peasant, a 400-year-old masterpiece of social satire about a farmer who out-argues Pharaoh's officials with nothing but razor-sharp rhetoric. Or the scribe who composed The Dialogue of a Man with His Soul, a philosophical exploration of despair so profound it predates existentialism by millennia. These weren't drones transcribing orders. They were thinkers, jesters, and occasionally rebels. A graffito in a quarry near Aswan shows a scribe's caricature of his overseer, complete with donkey ears, proving that even in a hierarchy as rigid as Egypt's, the pen could still mock the powerful. The greatest misconception of all, that their world was nothing like ours. But when you read a scribe's complaint about his aching back, or find a practice sheet where a student wrote, "I'd rather be fishing," the millennia between us dissolved. These weren't faceless functionaries. They were people overworked, ambitious, flawed, and brilliant, who just happened to live in a time when words were carved in stone instead of tapped on screen. And that, perhaps, is the most human truth of all. The life of an Egyptian scribe was never just about ink and papyrus. It was a delicate dance between duty and creativity, between the divine and the mundane. Each morning began with prayers to Thoth, each midday with the clatter of market disputes resolved, and each evening with the soft rustle of love poems penned by lamplight. They were mathematicians calculating pyramid slopes, healers preserving surgical knowledge, diplomats drafting treaties that held empires together, and poets whose words still ache with longing across 4,000 years. Their hands recorded everything from the weight of a farmer's grain to the whispers of a king's last breath, turning fleeting moments into eternity with nothing more than a reed brush and the resolve to bear witness. What's astonishing is how little the essence of their work has changed. Modern accountants hunched over spreadsheets, journalists racing against deadlines, even influencers curating their digital legacies, all are heirs to the scribe's craft. The tools have evolved from palettes to keyboards, from papyrus to pixels, but the core remains. We still live and die by the stories we choose to record. A tax audit today isn't so different from the scribe's ledger in Memphis. A doctor's chart echoes their medical papyri, and every time someone snaps a photo to remember this moment, they're tapping into the same human urge that once drove scribes to carve prayers into tomb walls. Yet there's a lesson in their legacy that feels urgent now. In an age of endless data, where information floods us like the Nile's annual surge, the scribes remind us that not all records are equal. They didn't just write, they decided what was worth preserving. A farmer's protest, a soldier's letter home, the exact angle of a star used to align a temple. These weren't random choices. They were acts of love, defiance, and sometimes even subversion, ensuring that the voices of the powerless could outlast the monuments of kings. So here's a question to carry with you, one those ink-stained hands might have posed. If you were a scribe, what would you document? The receipts piling in your drawer, or the way your child laughs when the light hits their face just so, the meeting minutes, or the quiet courage of someone the world overlooks. The scribes teach us that writing isn't just about keeping records, it's about deciding who and what gets to be remembered, and that power, as they knew well, is the closest thing we have to immortality.